Okay, this is the intro to the recording for the Friday night Sabbath Eve Bible study for the first day of February 2019. We'll give the Hebrew date as soon as we go live. We'll be streaming live tonight, God willing, on Facebook Live Sabbath service page, and this recording will go into the archive. And we'll begin just as soon as we get a green light from Facebook Live. Well, good evening, friends. Welcome to this Friday evening Sabbath Eve Bible study. After a long, grueling week, this is I'll give you the date on the Hebrew calendar first. This is the 27th day of the 11th month on God's holy sacred calendar. It's the first day of February on 2019. Okay, 27th day of the 11th month. Now, just a quick reminder, this year on God's sacred calendar is one of the 7 leap years out of each 19-year time cycle. And so what does that mean? What happens in a leap year on the Hebrew calendar? Well, a whole extra month is thrown in to the calendar. Not just an extra day like on the Roman calendar when you have a February 29 once every 4 years on a pagan Roman calendar leap year, but on the 7 leap years out of the 19-year time cycle on the Hebrew calendar, on God's sacred calendar, a whole extra month is thrown in. And it's a repeat of the last month. By name, it's a repeat of the last month. It's called Adar 2. Instead of just Adar, there becomes an Adar 1 plus an Adar 2. And where normally Adar by itself in a non-leap year would be 29 days, it becomes 30 days. Am I telling you that right? One of the Adar months is 30 days, and the other one is 29 days between Adar 1 and Adar 2. Now, that much of it is correct. And let's see. Yeah, because whichever one it is. Yeah, Adar 30 does not appear in a non-leap year. Because there's only 29 days in Adar when it's in the 12th month when it's a non-leap year. When it's a leap year, then one of the repeated Adar months has 30 days in it, the other has 29. That makes it work out for setting the lunar situation in cycle with the sun. It straightens it out every 19 years. Okay, all right. We're not going to go into a long discussion of the Hebrew calendar. I do have to get a copy of John Cose's book that we used in the year-long 2-semester class on the Hebrew calendar at Ambassador College. And I have... Ben, I have it. You don't even have to look for it on the internet and download it. I have it. I can just attach it to an email and send it to you. I have it on one of my computer hard drives, so I just got to access it, find it, and that's on my to-do list of things to do. Okay, now, tonight I'm going to answer a few questions that some of you asked me that I wasn't able to get to. Well, I'm going to at least answer one off top of my head because it's kind of several days have gone by since you asked me. I'm trying to get things in condition, in order here, things repaired so that I can pass a mortgage inspection. And as of today, I got into some conversations with my bank. There's been several things I haven't liked about the reverse mortgage idea that I've been working on for months. In fact, I first started the reverse mortgage process 4 or 5 years ago. I started that in 2015, maybe even 2014, so 4 or 5 years ago. And I put it off in order to, so I could get a better arrangement by adding some years to my life and adding some, I was paying everything by cash. And they said, you need to do something on credit so that you have a credit record that, can give you score points, because that affects your interest rate and how much we can give you and blah, 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 blah. So I've done that for the past 4 years. And in fact, that got me on a path of making repairs that were needed here on the building. And as I made one repair, I found out we needed others. And as I tried to repair the roof over the past 2 years with several $1,000s worth of just repair stuff, I finally got to the position where, by doing credit and building up enough and having a credit record, I was offered enough credit to completely put on a new roof in the leaking area above the second floor. And but of course that meant I borrowed more money. And all of that has impact and effect on the amount of money you borrow versus the amount of money that you have as income. And there's a ratio there, and that'll affect your credit score. And even when you're going to pay off all those loans, when they're giving you the money, they don't consider that you've got those all paid off with what they're giving you. They use that in order to raise the interest rate they charge you. So it's a game. It's a game. But I found out my bank may do me better with a regular mortgage than the reverse mortgage people do. And even though you don't have to, in your lifetime, you don't have to pay back the reverse mortgage, it gets left on the property for other people that, your heirs or whoever you might leave property to. There's equity left in the place, but you also leave them this unpaid mortgage. And if we are going to go on any length of time, I'm thinking I might just take a regular mortgage and pay off all these other debts that are at 30 and 40% interest, somewhere ranging in between, well, they range between 25 and 40% for some of the loans I've taken out. And pay those off, so I'm only paying like 4 point, whatever they told me, some 4, maybe 5% interest. Compared to 30, 40% interest rates, that's quite a bit of difference in money, and they would stretch out the mortgage for, a number of years, so the monthly payment would be relatively low, just a few $100s instead of, I'm paying $800-900 a month now on loans and interest. And that don't leave me much to operate on and fix stuff with. So, and this compares actually to what the EU does with their member countries. In a way, they don't let member countries' debt get but a certain percentage of their gross domestic product, which is an equivalent thing of saying for an individual of your income, your ratio of your income versus your debt. And now when you can have everything paid off, that's great. But Mr. Armstrong saw the wisdom in using debt in a reasonable way when we financed the building of the auditorium, for example, that was dedicated to God. I was just talking to a couple of young fellows that have a tremendous interest in the church. They have had that for the last 3 or 4 years, and they are beginning a growing process little by little in their learning, and they are observing all of the annual holy days. And, that's nice. That is really nice to see. It makes me recall and remember the time when God was calling me. I didn't grow up in the church like some of you that I know who tune in here. You grew up in the church, and there's a difference. You're not cut off from God the way the rest of the world was and is. For the large part, for the fall harvest, the people who will be called, the great majority who will be called to the fall harvest, are cut off from God right now. Ever since Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, taking the forbidden fruit, deciding that they would decide for themselves what's right and wrong, and they set a precedent for their offspring. I mean, God said, okay, Adam, out of the garden, you go make your own laws, your own ways, do things, do it your own way. And that's what the rest of mankind is assigned to do. And write the lesson in history, the way it's going to come out is that mankind without God cannot govern himself. Not effectively, anyway. I mean, you got to look at the news this past week and past weeks ad infinitum almost, looking at Brexit, for example, in the UK and the EU. What a mess. What a mess that's showing as to how effectively man cannot govern himself. That's going to continue. My prediction is that's going to continue to be a soap opera all the way up until the fifth seal opens up. And the fifth seal will begin. Let's put those seals up on the screen while we're reviewing things. Tonight, friends, before we play some of Mr. Armstrong speaking, and I've got him cued at a portion of a telecast he gave that relates to what's happening right now. It'll repeat some things, but he'll answer some questions and things that we need to have our focus on. We do want to stay on the solid foundation that God laid for us through his end-time apostle, who has not been replaced with another apostle, through whom God began building a church, and I emphasize a church, because God was building a church, one church, not a whole bunch of churches, plural, or denominations. And yes, that means he's not building all these blankety-blank, banana-peeling Church of God groups out there. That is not of God. That's of the doing of individual ministers and some members who are backing up those ministers. That everybody who does that is going to have to answer for it. And you need to listen. Where God has left us at this point is a form of punishment. And yet we can repent during that punishment and show God where we stand. And that's what's happening. God is watching each one of us, minister or lay member or minister. He's watching each one of us, and there's an instruction that Mr. Armstrong very much encouraged us to do that Jesus Christ spoke in Luke 21:36. Now, some of you who watch me often, either here on Sabbath services, Sabbath.tv, or on the weeknight World Watch TV program from WorldWatch.tv that we also stream on Facebook Live, you may even be saying, there's Stephen again, mentioning that one verse that he thumps over and over again. That's not the only verse I ever quote and cite, but it is, I agree with you, it's one of the most predominant ones I mention, because it is the thing by which we who are called to the spring harvest, it is the one foremost thing by which God is judging us now. Yes, we have to live by Matthew and Luke 4:4, not by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. And that includes, of course, yes, keeping the commandments. So let's put that up front on the table. Let's make sure we're square in understanding that. Yes, we have to observe the commandments. Now, do we earn our salvation by keeping those commandments? Absolutely. Somebody come online on the post and say yes or no. Absolutely. Yay or nay. Well, I can't see. Let me see if anybody's out there doing that right now. Can I get on there and see what's going on? Oh, some of you are writing me on Messenger. I can't take Messenger right now. Let me see. In fact, Messenger is very difficult for me. I wish some of you would post on the where we do the live streamings. But let me see. Can I see the postings while I'm transmitting? I can't even find our live stream. Are we actually out there streaming? I've got one over here that shows me the live stream, just a test to see if we're on. And yeah, it looks like we're on. But it's very delayed on the postings on that thing. Let's see. Tonight on the Roman calendar, what did I say? It is February 1st. Let's see. Can I find this? Okay, I'm not going to be able to do that, and I need somebody to help me with that, to set up another monitor where I can see, which is something I would like to do. I would like to have more interactive back and forth with you that while you're watching live. Of course, you could even do this if you're watching from the archive, if you're watching it on Facebook Live. If I ask a question, you can go ahead and pop your answer in the comment area, just so other people see what, different brethren may have to say or think. And I'll take a look at it later, and I might even reply to you and say, hey, good, or no, I have track a little bit, which I try to avoid doing, but unless you really need me to help re-steer you, or somebody else might do it too. But the answer to the question I just asked, I was about to say, absolutely not. Now, I have to admit to you, I'm very tired tonight. Because of some equipment problems we had this week. The night we had the equipment problems, Wednesday night, when I was not able to do the live stream Wednesday evening for the World Watch TV news related to the Bible and Prophecy stream Wednesday night, a very critical night, we had equipment problems. I stayed up until 4 o'clock in the morning until I got the equipment fixed where I could then get on and do the live stream. By then, I had to rethink, okay, what all did I have lined up for the program? Because I spent all that time focusing on getting the equipment fixed, and it was an important night. If the devil can interfere with your equipment, that was the one day of the week, of the month, of the year to do it. If he wanted to prevent me from being able to speak on something that was extremely important that day. And I wonder how many people caught it that day, Wednesday. All right, let me finish the statement, though. I was up till 4 o'clock Wednesday night. That would have been 4 o'clock in the morning on Thursday. And then Thursday night, I was up, which was last night, I was up till 3 o'clock in the morning, that meaning this morning, and I threw my regular sleeping hours way off. Plus, I'm doing things to try to do repairs, plus keep up everything, repairs to the building, beside repairing equipment that goes, sour, that goes haywire on us. Let me finish my thought about the mortgage that I'm working on. First thing I want to do when I get that mortgage is, I'll come back to where we were in a moment. If I can share with you a few thoughts of where I am, I think it may help you in your relation with those of you who tune in here regular, and some of the things I'd like to ask you to pray about is not forget Kathleen Williams, the church 50 year greater than, she came into the church in the early 60s in Birmingham, Alabama, and her family that's not in the church has stuck her, one of her family members stuck her in a nursing home against her will. And it took a while to realize what was going on, that finally wound up in the family saying no church members, including her minister, could come in and visit her. And they're forcing drugs on her, which I had some involvement in keeping her, being able to help her of her own volition and will, as she would tell them, I don't want to take that. I don't want that. And they try to use me to get her to take them. And I'd say, look, I can't dictate what she does on that, and you shouldn't either. You should honor her will on that. If she says she doesn't want that, the past administrator's policy here was that you're supposed to just write down she refused, and then that's it. Don't give it to her. But then they had a new administrator come in, and the family says, we want her taking that. We want her dolled up. And they have a plan for burying her with her twin sister. And they want her to die first. I mean, I've figured it out. And how much of this should I tell you? Because I ordered a book after hearing Elisa Roth speak on public radio that relates to how people are mistreated and locked away against their will. And that's one of the things that happened, that would have happened to God's end-time apostle had God not intervened and stopped it. By that one of Mr. Armstrong's, what he thought was very loyal assistants and servants, who was working with the woman that he had married, who was going to sign some paperwork in the state of, where were they? Tucson, in Arizona. Arizona is the worst state in the union for being able to put away people against their will, especially an older family member. And this woman, who was his second wife for a while, was going to sign those papers to have him locked into the mental ward of an institution, against, and under the guise that he was senile and mentally insufficient, whatever their fancy terms for all that is. And then we're going to put away Mr. Armstrong. And then that attorney, who actually was very helpful to the church and to Mr. Armstrong during the attack by the state of California back in 1979, 78, 79, 80. But you can turn good. God says if you turn evil, all the good you did will be forgotten. So it's very important, brethren, that we repent of our sins, get sin out of our lives, as it applies to you and me individually before Christ returns. And let me bring that back around to where I was about Luke 4:4, Matthew 4:4, how we have to live by every word of God, keep God's commands. But I asked the question, the one that the answer to is absolutely not. Do we earn our salvation by keeping the commandments? And my response to that was going to be absolutely not. We don't earn our salvation. That's a free gift. But we do earn our reward in God's kingdom as to where and how God places us over cities and that kind of things. You are rewarded according to your works in that situation. But your reward is after you're made transformed from flesh to spirit, from mortal to immortal, from corruptible to incorruptible, after you're part of the family of God as an eternal spirit being. But that is a gift, but it's a gift like an inheritance that you can disqualify for. Like an inheritance where somebody leaves a will and says, I'm leaving all my stuff to this son or that daughter or this person or that person, provided they don't smoke anymore, or provided they marry a gal with blonde hair and pink eyes. I'm just, they can put conditions in their will and say, this gift of inheritance is subject to certain qualifications. Maybe they'll say, if they're extremely rich and, it's going to be billions of dollars or something, they say, well, they get $100,000 now, but they get the $1 billion after they turn age 40. And so if they're going to lie about their age and say they're 39 forever, they never get it. I'm just being weird on that. I read silly and weird, but a person can put qualifications in a will where their inheritance is given only if the person meets certain conditions and qualifications. And God has done that with eternal life. We have to put sin out of our lives, and by putting sin out, that keeps us from disqualifying for the gift. That meets the qualification for the gift. But we didn't earn it. It's still a gift. I mean, the amount of works that we might attempt to do could never earn the great value of eternal life. It's just, that is such a gift. I mean, you can't put a value on that. That is so invaluable. You can't put a price tag on eternal life. You could never do enough works or keeping of the commandments. You could never do enough to earn how valuable eternal life is. I mean, that's life without end. We had a beginning, but we get to, if we make it into God's kingdom, when we're given that gift, then we have life from then on without end. And I know it's hard for humans to totally comprehend eternity, but we're able to understand and speak about that much. God has explained that much. He never had a beginning. He doesn't have an end. He never had a beginning. That's hard for us who did have a beginning. It's hard for us to wrap our minds around eternity that it goes back to never having had a beginning at all. But that's the wonderful thing about this. It's like, hey, there's something that physically, with a human mind, I can't fully understand and comprehend. But by looking at the heavens, I can see there's a wonderful being out there who's full of, and who's given us evidence of his love in his word, such that, look, we know he's good. We know he's loving. Thankfully, he's not like a monster that's going to turn on you and make you suffer. Now, he's put us here in the human flesh where we can be subject to stupid, idiot human beings who can do the kind of evil that would put people in torture and burn them with gasoline and cages and do all kind of evil. And, it behooves us to pray every day as we pray, that God, when I walk out of this house, and even while I'm still here inside of it, please provide protection today. And, there's wisdom in doing that and asking God for protection and thanking him for it every day after, hey, God, thank you. I made it through this day. Nobody beat me up. A car didn't run over me accidentally or on purpose, and I didn't fall down a flight of stairs, and I didn't get caught outside in this terrible cold that could cause frostbite in a matter of minutes, depending on how minus below zero the temperature went. In some cases, like the news reports this week were saying, at 5 minutes you could have frostbite at a certain temperature, like minus 30 degrees, I think it was. Maybe that's 10 minutes, but still a very short time outdoors. You've got to be well dressed and not stay out there long in it. Get inside to warm shelter in temperatures like that. And that's a reminder to ask God before we started to, when I open my mouth, you fill it. Matthew 24, verse 20 is popping into mind to just remind us all that, especially in a winter like this one right here, we especially should be praying, as Christ instructed in that verse, that our flight for those who are counted worthy to escape, for the portion of the woman who's given 2 wings of a great eagle, that flight, symbolically, whatever that might be, like John was saying, God could do that. Literally, he did a great fish for Jonah. And I make the comparison only because God uses the word great with the fish he made for Jonah, and he calls this eagle, the symbolic or literal eagle of Revelation 12:14, where it speaks of our flying on two wings of an eagle. He calls it a great eagle, two wings of a great eagle. So you contrast the language, great fish, great eagle. Now that'll probably, because of the book of Revelation, truly be symbolic, and John, having no aircraft had not been invented in 90 A.D. at the time the Apostle John was writing that vision, where he may have seen people being flown on modern aircraft into the Middle East, and probably into Israel, probably near Jerusalem, if not Tel Aviv, where we come up to Jerusalem, see the army surrounding Jerusalem, and then we're told at that point we are to flee to the mountains. Well, where are the mountains? There are no mountains right there, no significant mountains, just little hills. He's talking about the mountains in Petra, across the Jordan River, that gets you into what's now the land of Jordan. And Petra is a suburb in the southern part of Edom, which is part of that tri-regional area, tri-regional, tri-city. I say regional because those wilderness areas are huge. They're not like a city, and they're not like cities at all. They are wilderness. That God describes in Daniel 11, verse 41, as being the only area on the face of the earth during the time of the Great Tribulation, the fifth seal. It's the only place in the Bible that's described as being protected by God. And since that's a place of protection, of nourishment, protection, safety, as we called it for a long time, a place of final training, there's that wonderful magnificent old castle of Karak in Moab, and the tri-regional area that that God is describing through Daniel in chapter 11, verse 41 of Daniel, refers to the land of the children of Ammon, Moab, and Edom. And it says it the other way, of Edom, Moab, and Ammon, but it's all that same area. They're all adjacent. They they're in adjoinment to one another. That whole area is protected, and that's the wilderness that we will have access to and be protected in and be flown over to and be chased by the devil as we try to get in there, as we go through the rock walls of Petra that reminded Mr. Armstrong of the gelled-up walls of the Red Sea when ancient Israel was marching through the Red Sea, and then Pharaoh decided to send his army after them and chase them. And God then let the walls of water ungel and come crashing down upon Pharaoh's army. The devil is described as doing the same thing in Revelation 12, right after verse 14, where it says our method of transportation will be two wings of a great eagle. Then verses 15 and 16 describe the devil sending a flood, an army, after the portion of the woman. The woman is, in prophecy, is a church, and in Revelation 12 it's referring to the true church. It's referring to the true church, but only the portion of the true church, referring in those verses, in verses 14, 15, and 16, to the portion of the woman who's accounted worthy to escape. It's then referring to the remnant who's not accounted worthy to escape in verse 17 of Revelation 12, when it says, after stating in verses 15 and 16 that the devil is foiled when he sends his army after the woman that's accounted worthy to escape, because God opens up a big hole in the earth and swallows up that woman. Probably right there between the walls of Petra, as we're escaping and the devil sends an army after us. The devil's army is going to say, well, let's go in and get them. And as they march through the rock walls of Petra, just like in the times of ancient Israel with the gelled-up walls of the Red Sea, God's going to cause the earth to open up. All those rocks with an opened-up earth are going to fall into the open earth with the army, and all those rocks are going to come crashing down on that army. And then we will have gotten on through that passageway, and that passageway, and once God opens up the earth, has the rocks fall in, then that way is blocked off, making it easier to be protected. And God will actively provide protection, just like he did when Israel was marching through the Red Sea, and Pharaoh's army was assembling before them. Christ, the rock, was right there in a cloud of pillar of which way does it go? Pillar of fire by night, and a guiding cloud during the day to guide their way, and protection with lightning and all that stuff at night too. He was right there with them as their protection. He'll be right there protecting those who are accounted worthy to escape in that place of nourishment, in that wilderness region from Ammon through Moab down to Edom. And Petra will just become a big rock heap, no passageway through it after the earth opens up and the army marches through. Now, yeah, I'm using literary license as I describe that to you, because it's just, you put it together with what God tells you. You say, yeah, he opens up the earth. We're coming in. That's the mountain area that we're told to flee to. That's the entranceway to that wilderness that's described in Daniel 11 that's protected. And those of you sitting out there right now, I can see some of you. Some of my enemies tune in and watch, and they love to write these dill pickle blogs. I'm not going to say Dennis's first name, but his last name relates to a dill pickle. He loves to tune in and tell how weird Stephen is for staying faithful to the truth that God taught us through Mr. Armstrong. Oh, he loves to rant and rage about anybody who sticks with the truth. When he himself took a paycheck for about 20 years, he was the man I'm speaking about that loves to rant and rage against me was either a junior or a senior when I was a freshman out at Pasadena. I actually looked up to you, Dennis, and he was an all-American type of guy, an outstanding person, one of those persons that in the high schools or in his workplace or whatever, people would vote for this kind of guy as the all-American guy because he just physically was well-built, perfect, had a sharp, intelligent mind. He was able to learn what was taught at Ambassador College and go out for a couple of decades and teach it for a paycheck. And then opposition hits, the apostasy comes in, and then he decides he doesn't like the apostasy, but when he's no longer getting a paycheck, then he starts to say he doesn't like the truth that God taught us through Mr. Armstrong either. And so he's out in no man's land, but he's tuning in to those both to those who hold fast to the truth as we were taught. And of course, he does also, I have to compliment you in part on this, he also attacks those who have set up banana peeling Church of God groups, or as Mr. Collins used to call it, vanity plate Church of God groups, by taking, and I use the word banana peeling because grammarists say, what many ministers have done is they've made sure they have an adjective in front of the words Church of God that's different from any other Church of God group with its adjective. And the grammar people, they have this saying, they say, the adjective is the banana peeling of the parts of speech. It's your wrapper, it's your modifier. And so I just call them, since they're using different adjectives, I just call them what they are. They're banana peeling Church of God groups. They have an adjective. And each one calls it the ABC Church of God, and another calls it the XYZ Church of God. And they do that ad infinitum, at least 600 of them you can count, and that I've looked at. And one minister told me, no, Steve, you haven't checked it in a while. There's over 1,000. You got to go to all these different pages and websites and places, but there's over 1,000. Well, if you're spending your time checking all that out, I think you're wasting a lot of good time. But you can easily observe that there's hundreds of them. And I've had people call me and who finished the entire 58-lesson Ambassador College correspondence course and say, I understand what God's doing and I would like to come into that church, but when I look at all these blankety blank this and that named Church of God groups out there, that is confusion. And that God's not in that. He's not in that kind of confusion. And, and I've had to agree with people that have called me and said that. Well, you're right. Although, as they hung up, it's almost like they claim they talk like it's my fault. And I have not encouraged anybody to go out there and begin a blankety blank, vanity plate, banana peeling Church of God group. In fact, God used me as he revealed to Mr. Collins, you need to take the name off the group you started. And when Mr. Collins told me that, I said, Mr. Collins, you're resonating with God's Spirit in me 100%. That's exactly as I understand it. And he told me what God told him while he was in the hospital with cancer and gave me a couple or three reasons God had given him as to the damage being done by having, as he did at one time, a Church of God group with an adjective name placed in front of it, as he would call it, a vanity plate. He said, I'm guilty of doing what so many have done. I put together a vanity plate Church of God group. And the one he had put together, he'd called the Everlasting Church of God group. Well, God picked on him with that one in particular to undo it. And he'd go tell his group that we're taking the name off of this group. We're no longer going to call it the Everlasting Church of God. So God took what was called the Everlasting Church of God and said, no, that's not of me. It's not everlasting. We're going to stop this one. And he allowed Mr. Collins to have cancer. Mr. Collins told me, he said, I think that's why God let me have the cancer, so he could get my attention. And if that be the case, it worked, because while he was in the hospital with that, as Mr. Collins' own words to me were, Stephen, God was speaking to me then and telling me, when you get out of here, go tell those people, we're taking the name off, and I'll continue to conduct services and sermons for you, but not under the name of a group, and, not with a denomination or group or adjective or not with a vanity plate Church of God name on it, like as he put it. And then, because even Everlasting Church of God, everlasting was used as an adjective with Church of God, so there's your banana peeling, your wrapper, see around it. And he got rid of the wrapper in response to God telling him, you need to do that when you get out of this hospital. Now, what happened? Mr. Armstrong, I think you'd find this very interesting, sir, if, when you hear about all this, when you are alive again. When Mr. Collins took the name off of his group, the whole group, 100% of them, well, it wasn't all that many people, maybe a dozen, maybe 20, a dozen each meeting, but people would rotate, so 20, at one time he had 40, at one time he had several hundred. But it whittled down to 40, then kind of whittled down to 20, and then in an actual attendance, it was around a dozen. And all of those, that small number of people, 100% of them, they all told him, well, you can't come, we don't want you coming here and preaching to us anymore or ministering to us anymore. We're going to do our own ministry. We're going to keep that name and keep it going. He had to go get an attorney get the instruction on how to write a cease and desist letter, which he did. He wrote to them and said, look, I'm the one chose that name. God told me to undo it. And that, when you continue to use that name, I have the legal paperwork on that name. And I'm disbanding it. And you may not have it, and you may not use it. And so several weeks went by, they're still using it. And finally, when he does send the cease and desist letter, a week or two after that, 2 or 3 weeks after that, they finally responded and said, okay, all right, we're going to keep the group going, but we'll just, like you said, we won't use your name, the name you came up with. And they brought back, he'd had songbooks printed with that name on it, and cassette tapes of all his sermons that were labeled as the Everlasting Church of God. They brought all that back to Mr. Collins and said, okay, don't sue us. You don't have to do anything, waste any more money or any. We're going to comply and not use that name anymore. They continued to conduct services. They made it known he wasn't welcome, but they did come over and visit him at his home once one other time. In addition to bringing that back, Mr. Collins just invited them over during the week for an informal, friendly visit. And they came, and then later they came back and said, okay, we're turning in everything and not going to use that. I forget the order. The friendly visit may have been after that. I'm not certain. But anyway, we were able to have a friendly visit with them. I was caregiving Mr. Collins at that time, so I was present. And, God was steering and engineering that. They kind of acted like, oh, you are manipulating Mr. Collins. Oh, no, I was not. Not at all. Mr. Collins, in fact, if he saw me out of line or something, he would, boom. He wouldn't hesitate to let me know. And but for the most part, he would ask me questions. How was things done in Pasadena? What do you think Mr. Armstrong would say about this or that? Say, well, he'd say, what's in the Bible? Let's take a look in there, and I'll look up some actual quotes for you from Mr. Armstrong too. And he began to see that I was holding very, very fast, and we were able to work together very well. And then during my time of serving him, we had done the Sabbath service streams from the hospital while Mr. Collins was in the St. Vincent Hospital in Birmingham. I got permission from the hospital to cart in a whole bag full of, boxes full of equipment. It took more to do it than it takes today, but I brought in cameras and computers, and we did his video live streams from the hospital. In fact, the fellow that called from Tennessee to say, I finished the entire 58-volume correspondence course, but boy, I see all these churches of God, and that's confusion. He had initially seen one of Mr. Collins' Sabbath services from the hospital, from his hospital bed, during one of those live streams. And so once Mr. Collins was able to come home, we continued those streams. By the way, the doctor had told Mr. Collins, from the time you leave the hospital, you have about 3 weeks to live. And so when and he wasn't going to be allowed to come home unless he got a 24/7 caregiver, and Mr. Collins asked everybody else he knew before he asked me, would I do it? And the people that I say when he asked that he knew beside me, all of those people he had known for years and years and years and years in this Alabama, mostly Birmingham area, while I was in California those years. So I wasn't here for him to get to know as long. But after he asked the people he had known the longest, would you be my 24/7 caregiver? I'll even pay you out of my railroad monthly money, pension. I'll pay you $500 a month. Come in and, be my 24/7 that the doctor requires in order for me to go home. Everybody told him no. And then he said, Steve, would you do it? I said, Mr. Collins, I'll go home and pray about it tonight. I'll let you know in the morning. I knew that night, after praying, God answered the prayer very quickly. It was profoundly in my mind. You helped that man. You know the history of that man, how he would get up in the middle of his wife told you how he would get up in the middle of the night. If somebody called extremely sick, he'd drive 100 miles to go anoint them, then drive back home, put on his pajamas for another hour or two, and then get up and go work all day long at the railroad. And then after doing that one night, the next night, or whenever after that, somebody else called, he'd do the same thing all over again. And his wife said he never complained. And so God ran that memory through my mind. And he said, you know his history, and don't you dare tell him no. Don't you dare tell him no. So that next morning, when I saw him in the hospital, I said, Mr. Collins, yes, sir. The answer in prayer is yes, I will, and I will do it. And so then he told his doctor, and their doctor had the state run their, what's the word to use? When they examine you, evaluation, or they ran they ran me through their system to see that I would be okay for doing that. That came back thumbs up, like getting a top secret clearance in the military. They run a investigation and stuff on you. So that came back saying, okay, thumbs up, Stephen can be your caregiver, but not your wife's. Your wife will not be able to come home with you. We want a woman for that. And I understand that. That was good. And we couldn't find a woman. His wife couldn't find a woman. We tried to help. We couldn't find a woman who was willing to be her caregiver, so she had to stay in the hospital. And she stayed in the hospital till she died. We actually felt like, yeah, they killed her in the hospital. They transferred her over to another hospital where they were. We found out after the fact they had actually chained her up, and where she went for just a few weeks before she died, the nurses there said, "Hey, do you know that around her wrist and her ankles and her back, there is evidence that she was strapped, overstrapped, and she's got these bruises and things on her arms, her ankles, her back." And no, we didn't know that. When we would come for a visit, and we would go a couple times a day while she was, I'd drive Mr. Collins. We'd go over during those visiting hours. They'd let her up and we'd have her visit. She never told us that they were doing horrible things to her. They did have her in one of those places, though, that you have to enter with a code, and they can't get out of there. And that's the same thing that Cat Williams is in now. She's in a place where you've got to have a code, and if the family says you can't visit, that place will not let you in. In fact, when I tried to conduct Passover service, I even came to the outside patio area where they have bars, but I'd often have gone out into the outside area with Cat when I was allowed to come there, and we'd do our Sabbath services out there. It was beautiful. It was nice. But I came out there and I asked some of the nurses when they wouldn't let me inside the other way, I said, "Would you mind just bringing Cat here, put her in a chair here and let me conduct the what was I doing? I think the second Passover service for her, or was that the first? I can't remember, but they said no, and they called the police and had me barred for 1 year. If I set foot on that place, I'll be trespassing. So that's where the situation on that has gone. And when I heard Elisa Roth on public radio speaking about her book she had written called Insane, America's Criminal Treatment of Mental Illness. And I haven't read all of this book yet. I'm plowing through there to try to find something relevant to Kat's situation, Kathleen Williams' situation. A lot of what I've read so far, she's talking about people who are mentally ill who are put in jail. But on the radio, she was speaking in part about, people that are locked in these mental institutions against their will, who actually aren't even mentally ill and don't even show any signs of Alzheimer's or senility. I have videos from inside the place where Kat and I would be singing a song. I'd get Kat to let me record her singing, and we'd be reading the Bible, and I'd recorded some of it to be an actual shared with other people, and I'd stop and in the middle of a verse, and Kat would fill in the verse, and and everything about Kat, even the staff, even many of the people that worked in that place, the nicer people would even say to me, "Steve, she doesn't deserve to be here. She's more sane than a lot of us who are employed to work in this place." And, in a way, I'd kind of laugh about that. Well, that's kind of funny. But for a while, the treatment for Kat was it seemed like Kat was okay about it, and the place was nice. She enjoyed the people. She acted like she worked there. She would help people, and she seemed relatively happy there, except for the times when her family would come, and they would leave, and she'd want to leave with them, and their family would say, "No, now you have to stay." And Kat would be very sad, like, "Well, why? Why do I have to stay? I'm well now from the cold or the pneumonia I had when I came here, and oh no, you have to stay." And seeing her sadness, and her uncle had already told me that was done against her will, and that he didn't want that. He had his door open for her to stay in her bedroom where she had been for 50 years. They shared that house together, her and her uncle. And other family members did that in spite against the uncle, because when one of the family members had stayed there and had a dog and tore up his kitchen and his living room carpet and cabinets, he spent $3,000 repairing it and then said, the dog, you can keep the dog, but the dog has to stay outside. Well, the family member got mad, took their dog, moved in with their daughter, and then came and got Kat. And Kat tried to come back to her uncle's place, and they called the police and said she's a missing person. And she couldn't get in the place because she didn't have a key. They'd taken her key, and the uncle was at work. And so while the police spend half a day looking for her, she's sitting on the back porch at her uncle's home, where she had lived, like I said, for more than 50 years. From the time she was born, even, she lived in that same house. And anyway, they used that missing person report as part of their evidence that, see, she's a danger to herself. She knew the way home. She got home. And anyway, the uncle said, they told me it's a done deal. Don't try to stop it. Well, I saw an attorney who checked and said, no, it ain't a done deal. He said, Steve, if you want to do a petition and set up a legal guardian for her, now that means I need a woman who would be willing for about 6 months or so be her legal guardian, that the court would approve. And then once it's well established that she can take care of herself, with a legal guardian appointed, the legal guardian can say even to the family, I'm sorry, she wants to be on her own. You can't stick her in one of these places again. And now that'll cost $2,500 up front, but one of the first things I plan to do, and one reason I wanted to take out this mortgage, is to be able to pay that attorney and do that for Kat. And that's because it's borrowed money, I won't have to pay tithes or offerings on it. I run a ministry anyway, so it just go into paying ministry bills. But the first $2,500 out of that mortgage, I was saying to God in prayer today, and the attorney may need more than that. I said, Father, once you help me get this mortgage approved, the first $2,500 I'm taking to that attorney. We're going to start that process. Now, I realize as I'm explaining this to you, there's one piece beside the money. We need a person. There was one woman on the West Coast that was saying she would come here and do it, but then now she's reneged on that. So we're missing one thing. But once I have the mortgage, maybe God will provide the person who will say, Steve, I will do that. And then you could come and we could run you through the court process, and the court approves you. I would be the petitioner. The woman would be the legal guardian. And that's all I really should say about it at this point. And all of that, of course, is subject to God being willing, and that we keep prayers up that, in spite of the fact that they're double and triple dosing Kat with mind-dulling drugs that she doesn't want any of, God can answer the prayer that I keep praying. God, keep her strong. In spite of even that junk they're giving her, just, let it pass through her kidneys and out of her body like she never even had it. That's my prayer and request. And maybe you can back me up in making that prayer to God as well. Back to where I wanted to share that with you, brother, because I really would appreciate some prayers on that for Kat. She is not insane. She's being treated as if she were mentally ill when she's not. And she's, as Elisa Roth says in this book called Insane, with the subtitle reading, America's Criminal Treatment of Mental Illness. It's a crime, the way people in these institutions run them against the will of the person who's not even mentally ill, and they lock them in and treat them as if they were, and give them mind-dulling drugs against their will. And if the family says, cut off her church, cut off her minister, don't let him in here, they call the police, and the police then say, well, sir, if you set foot on this property, which this institution owns, we, the police, will come out and arrest you for trespassing. And if you even set foot on this property, we will arrest you for trespassing. and that applies for 1 year. After 1 year, you could set foot on it and we won't arrest you, but if they call us again, they'll start another year and we'll have to warn you, and then if you don't leave and if you set foot on this property, we will arrest you for trespassing. And in Alabama, it's almost as bad as Arizona. Not quite. Well, it may even be worse. Let me rephrase it. The books you read say Arizona is the worst place. That's the place that Mr. Armstrong's second wife and his what he thought was faithful attorney that turned Judas Iscariot on him, tried to put him in a mental institution in Arizona. And brother, Mr. Armstrong never explained that openly, but his servant Aaron Dean, who worked for him, who thought I knew when Stan Rader threatened to throw me out of the church when Mr. Armstrong and I were talking in Jerusalem at the Hilton Hotel when I was staying there already, and they flew in. I was going to work the dig every day. I had a business and I had some money then. I was able to do that. I was there when they flew in, and during lunch, Mr. Armstrong saw me in the lobby and hollered at me, "Stephen!" and summoned me over. And I came over, and everybody else that was there, including his former faithful attorney and Henry Cornwall and others that were there, and the television crew, they all stayed back because they saw Mr. Armstrong summon me over, and they just kept a respectful distance. But Henry Cornwall told Stan Rader that he heard every word I said to Mr. Armstrong, which he did not, because he told Stan Rader that I was explaining their plot to take him to the doctor and get him diagnosed as senile and mentally ill, so they could use his wife's declaration to lock him up and then take over the work. That actually happened. There are people who know that actually, the attempt to do that. When I say that happened, I'm talking about the attempt to have Mr. Armstrong put away that way actually happened. They attempted to do that. And Stan Rader called me to ask me what all Mr. Armstrong and I said together. And I refused to tell him. I just thought it was none of his business to know what a church member and a minister, even the head minister, were talking about. I probably should have been more polite to Mr. Rader, and I probably should have, I say that, but I do kind of feel like I was under inspiration as I said, "Mr. Rader, I don't think that's any of your business." I used to be in Mr. Rader's home a lot. I used to date one of his daughters for about a year. And I was like welcome. I was like a member of the family. I could practically walk in the house anytime I wanted. And so I had a certain familiarity with him. So when I said, "I don't think it's any of your business," I was talking to him like somebody you knew well. I wasn't trying to be smart aleck, but I just thought that was applicable. I said, unless he tells you as an employee, and he wants you to know, I don't think it's any of your business what somebody talks to him about in a private conversation, unless he invites you over to be part of the conversation. He didn't like that at all. He pronounced me as persona non grata right there on the spot, and I didn't know what that word meant from a hoot, from a hoot owl. I mean, from anything. I thought, the thoughts that you try to be positive. So I thought, oh, is he complimenting me in some way? I'm persona non grata. Well, no, just like some of you know what that word means, I went after that meeting, and of course he walked away in a bit of a huff, and he obviously was upset with me, so I immediately dismissed the idea that he might be complimenting me in some way, complimenting me for refusing to tell him what we talked about. No, he was telling me I'm not welcome in their group. I had been invited to attend the Bible study that Mr. Armstrong was doing from his room that night in the hotel. But persona non grata means you're not welcome in the group at all. And Aaron came and told me on top of that, "Steve, Mr. Rader said the next time he sees your face, he is going to tell you you are disfellowshipped." He hasn't done it yet, but he said next time he sees your face, he's going to do that. I said, well, let me put two and two together. He better not see my face then if I don't want to be put in the awkward position of being disfellowshipped. So I said, "Aaron, I'm moving rooms. I'm going to ask the hotel not to let anybody know I'm here." They're willing to do that in a lot of hotels. They'll keep you as anonymous if you request it. And so I requested that and said, I've checked out of this room. If anybody asks, tell them I've checked out. They said, okay, because you have checked out of that room. I've moved into another room. I wanted to make sure Mr. Rader didn't see me when I left. Plus, I wanted to ask God what to do. I went into a fast. And I did not know about their plot, even though Henry Cornwall says he heard me explaining their plot to Mr. Armstrong. That bunk. I didn't even know. I had no idea about it. It was a year later when Aaron Dean came up to me in the auditorium in Pasadena and said, Steve, well, you were right after all. I said, about what, Aaron? We're right about what? He said, about their plot. To take Mr. Armstrong to get him put in the thing and all that. I said, Aaron, oh, that puts the whole picture together. That's why Stan Rader was so angry with me. He thought I knew that. Aaron, I didn't know that. I did not know that. If they, somewhere in the course of things, they, as y'all found out they were doing that, tried to do that, and you thought I knew, you too thought I knew after you found out what they were doing. And that, and of course, that's why they were so angry with me. And maybe even Aaron thought I was trying to explain it to Mr. Armstrong. No, we were just talking about what he did that morning on his typewriter, having typed out a personal and faxed it on that little facsimile machine they carry around with them to publishing in Pasadena by using a telephone cradle on the fax machine, the early versions of a fax machine from his hotel room. And then half hour later, getting a full typeset copy back that publishing had completely typeset from what he typed on his typewriter and faxed to them. They typeset and faxed back, all nicely typeset so he could proofread it. He could see then, this was back in about 6 years before he died, roughly six. When was it that Ramona and Mr. Armstrong was divorced? It was before their divorce. Just before their divorce. I was in the early 80s, 80, 81, somewhere in there, after the big state of California attack, and Stan Rader was in very high position with Mr. Armstrong because Mr. Armstrong was so thankful to him at that time. I appreciated him so much for his effective handling of things against the state. And, of course, we all know God gave favor on that. So all that Mr. Rader did was with God opening doors of favor, but some of that favor was using the sharpness of mind, that the Jewish mind that Stan Rader had. Excellent, outstanding. Mr. Armstrong was so happy with Mr. Rader that even when he was dismissing Mr. Rader, he gave him a nice big bonus, and after understanding even what he had attempted to do against him. But that's why you would hear Mr. Armstrong shortly after that, in several of his sermons, be explaining, brethren, you can see from how I'm speaking to you and saying there's nothing senile or mentally ill or deficient about my mind. Now, of course, some enemies would say, well, yeah, you are mentally ill preaching this truth, because they consider the truth to be stranger than fiction, but that's only because God hasn't open their minds to it or called or given them to it. And some preachers, some ministers, like one I was just speaking to, went out for 20 years preaching it for a paycheck. Didn't believe it, didn't understand it. Of course, even Joe DeGatch Jr. comes across in that same way. He took a paycheck and preached it as a minister for years and didn't believe it. It means he didn't fully understand it, but he was able to parrot it. He was able to, memorize and learn what Mr. Armstrong was teach and parrot it instead of believing it, knowing it, and putting your life on the line with it. All right, we have 20 minutes left, and I have about that much of a recording by Mr. Armstrong. I asked God to inspire me tonight. God led me to this and a portion of this telecast. We played this before, this one, but we're going to pick up at a point where Mr. Armstrong is explaining how Sunday keeping came about. One of the UK and the US are having big problems right now. Big problems. Both of the countries. The US, the United States, is in what's called a partial shutdown was supposed to be temporary, but continues as if it were permanent. And we're having the worst polar vortex styled winter ever, a generation winter, some are calling it, which is interesting because verse 34 of Matthew 24 talks about this generation shall not pass till all these things occur, which includes Christ intervening to stop mankind from blowing up all mankind from off the face of the earth. Not only all mankind, all flesh from the face of the earth. And that couldn't happen before this generation. Since 1955 with the development of the hydrogen bomb and the successful testing of that nuclear weapon that is so powerful that it can destroy an entire, each one could destroy an entire city. That couldn't happen before today. So we are the annihilation generation that Christ was speaking of, that would, when all these things could happen, including annihilation of mankind, could happen in our generation. So that's us. And we're watching it till we start the countdown clock of 3.5 years from the time the Great Tribulation begins. And, you know, nobody knows when that's going to begin. That's going to begin like a thief coming in the night, like a little animal getting caught in a trap, like a mouse getting caught in a mousetrap, as Mr. Armstrong used to say. If he were expecting that, he would avoid it. You know, if you knew a thief in the night were coming, you'd have security guards around. But no, they come when you don't expect it. And Christ says in verse 35 of Luke 21, that's how the Great Tribulation comes. It comes as a snare, like an animal trap, a snare, upon who? A few people here and a few people there? No, Christ says in that verse, it comes upon all them that dwell upon the face of the whole earth. And that's why in the next verse, 36, he says, therefore, because this thing comes like a thief in the night, it's a good idea, therefore, that you be watching. And watching what? He was just describing these seals from Revelation. He's saying watch those that are active. And his explanation as to the promise he provides is so that you can escape all that's going to happen next. Where's my Bible? You know, the way the King James words that is telling you that you can avoid the 5th, 6th, and 7th seal, because the next major event in prophecy, as God's end-time apostle stated it, and it hasn't occurred as of yet, is the 5th seal, Great Tribulation. That's the next event. It hasn't happened yet. And so Christ, when he says here in verse 36, the latter part of verse 36, so that you may be accounted worthy to escape what? To escape all these things that shall come to pass. What he's saying there, so that you can escape the next major event in prophecy, the 5th seal, Great Tribulation, and what follows that, the year-long day of the Lord during the 7th seal. And in between that are the heavenly signs, the signs in the heavens, the astro signs in the sun, the moon, the stars, that tells us we're now about to enter the last year of that Great Tribulation, with God pouring out his wrath in the year-long day of the Lord, with the first 4 trumpets being the 4 winds, the last 3 trumpets being the 3 woes, and Christ returning on that 3rd woe to pour out the 7 last plagues. And as he does that, thankfully, those who are accounted worthy to stand before the Son of Man in the first resurrection will have been transposed from flesh into spirit, from mortal to immortal, from corruption to incorruption, as we watch Christ pour out those 7 last plagues on the humans and the flesh. On the whole earth suffers that. So that may be so bad that even that protected area that people were in, that those accounted worthy to escape, would have been in east of the Jordan River, Moab, Edom, Ammon in the north. That may even be affected by the 7 last plagues. But at that point, those accounted worthy to stand before the Son of Man, that to be in the first resurrection, will have been transposed into spirit and be with Christ as he pours out those 7 last plagues. Not transposed and changed after the 7 last plagues, like Mr. Armstrong's son incorrectly taught. He taught several things incorrectly, his son did, and was out, as I was sadly having to discuss today, out, failing to repent of sin in such a way that it's just sad. It's sad. It's sad. But, like Mr. Armstrong said, some were put in positions and were never converted. So he may still have his opportunity, and hopefully he will, in the second resurrection. A wonderful person. And Mr. Armstrong would like to see him living in eternity. And, and the question, what about Adam and Eve? Well, I'm not going to go there. That's God's call on that one. But those who asked this question about, was Mr. Armstrong the end time? Let me bring that back so when I'm pointing, he's up there. Was Mr. Armstrong the end time Elijah? Well, from personal observation, I can tell you God definitely performed the thing that's talked about in Malachi 4. Malachi, the last book of the Bible, and the last chapter of the last book of the Bible, Malachi 4. And in verses 4, 5, and 6, God is saying there, okay, Steve, come on, you got to get there quickly because we got to have time for Mr. Armstrong without speeding him up too much. In verses, the last 3, 4 verses, verse 4, God says, "Remember you the law of Moses, my servant, which I have commanded unto him in Horeb for all Israel with the statutes and judgments." And then right after that, he says, "Behold," although there is a paragraph mark like it's a new thought or paragraph, but those are men's markings for paragraphs. "Behold, I will send you," and sometimes they get it right, sometimes they don't, but for the paragraph indications, but sometimes they shouldn't be broken into new sections, sometimes they work well. But verse 5, Malachi 4, "Behold, I will send to you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." Now, the day of the Lord is that 7th seal, that very last thing, but he says before it, and he doesn't say how long before it. So, that can apply to the time Mr. Armstrong was alive. That can also be kind of an indication that, as some have thought and taught, that God may resurrect Mr. Armstrong to be one of the 2 witnesses, to be the one perhaps for, since they're considered candlesticks, to be the one for the Philadelphia era candles, or, those under that candlestick. And it could be, who knows, God may work a repentance with his son to be the other witness for the Laodiceans. He often, spoke of things that relate to being happy to be a Laodicean. So he might be the candlestick for them, his son. And God worked a repentance. He worked a repentance quickly on the Apostle Paul, who was Saul, going out and killing brethren. So, who knows? A lot of this is God's option as to how he's going to work out a lot of these end-time things. We just have to watch it and do what he said we should be doing. Especially, we need to follow the instruction of Christ in Luke 21:36, because that's the criteria spelled out in the same verse by which he decides who's accounted worthy to escape and who's accounted worthy to stand before the Son of Man in the first resurrection. Both of those relate back to, did you do what Christ said do in Luke 21:36? Did you watch these daily events of the 4 seals that are active now, and did you pray without ceasing about them so that you could then escape the 5th seal and the 7th seal? Did you do that? Oh, I was keeping the commandments. Well, yeah, but you got to Luke 4:4, Matthew 4:4. You got to live by every word of God. You can't just keep the commandments and that's it, because God says those who are left behind, the remnant that he mentions in verse 17 of Revelation 12, they keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of God. Now, that's contrary. The Bible is contrary to what one deacon was preaching in a sermon that one of you sent to me to listen to, and I listened to it. I don't always, because if I listened to everything everybody sent me, I wouldn't have time to do my own Bible study and carry on with the programs I do and etc. I wouldn't have time to eat. But I listened to that one, and and it was a good reason why I don't listen to everything everybody sends me. The minister said, those who are left behind and not accounted worthy to escape were not keeping the commandments of God. Well, man, you don't know your Bible, because God says in the last verse of Revelation 12, verse 17, the remnant who keeps the commandment of God. God says they were keeping the commandments. So you say, well, why were they left behind then? Well, good logic. That's a good question. And the answer to that, God gives you in Luke 21:36. They were left behind because in spite of Richard, a minister out there, saying, oh, it didn't work while Mr. Armstrong was alive, so we don't have to watch them daily seals. Man, you are in danger of hellfire, in danger of causing a lot of brethren to stumble with that kind of errant, non-holding fast preaching. Because Christ himself said, if you want to be accounted worthy to escape, and if you want to be accounted worthy to stand before the Son of Man in the first resurrection, you need to be doing those two prerequisites at the start of Luke 21:36. That's, in spite of all the scattering, the punishment we're under now, you can win favor with God if you are following carefully the instruction Christ gave us in Luke 21:36. That'll buy you a lot of mercy. You get accounted worthy to escape, even if you still got some things you got to have straightened out in your head or heart. You'll have 3.5 years. Christ can still be working on you in a place of nourishment. So just get yourself accounted worthy to escape the great tribulation by watching and praying always. They say, oh, yeah, okay, that sounds easy. It sounds easy, but try it. If you ain't tried it already. If you haven't tried that, if you're not watching, and if you're the praying every day, that's the part that puts a burden on you of a certain thing, to get on your knees and pray with all your heart for the people affected by these 4 seals in the daily news. Why, you want to think about what you're going to eat and who you're going to play with, who you're going to talk to, and what fun you're going to have, and what you're going to do with your money you earn from bonus at work or whatever, all the things that we want to think about other than getting on our knees and praying with our whole heart, with all our might, mind, and soul, and all the time, even while you're working on other stuff, thinking about the people affected by the daily events of these 4 seals. There are people starving now. One of the stories this week regarding Venezuela, with the millions of people marching out of Venezuela, they're leaving there because of the economy and food. No food. People are starving. As one lady in the news said this week, people are starving here. Do we care? That's one of the seals, the 3rd seal depicted by a black horse in Revelation. Christ called it limus, famine, or scarcity of food. People are starving. Are you praying about them? Do you care? Do you really pitch it to God? God, we need you to bring this kingdom and wrap this thing up. People are starving wholesale now, not just a few here and a few there, wholesale starving. You care? Are you praying? If you're not, you're going to be left behind. That's what Christ said. Watch and pray without ceasing, to be accounted worthy to escape all that's going to happen next, beginning with that 5th seal. All right, did I leave Mr. Armstrong any time here? I got 7 minutes for you, Mr. Armstrong. We're just going to take a portion. We're going to get some of Mr. Armstrong in. He's going to be explaining how Israel, ancient Israel, our forefathers, led us astray with worshiping on the first day of the week, then called on the 8th day, and created a feast during the time of Halloween, a month after the Feast of Tabernacles, to keep the people of Israel from going back to the house of Judah, going back to Solomon's son Rehoboam. Jeroboam tried to keep them off to himself. He thought, if they go back and keep that Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem, I'm going to lose them. He might not have, but that's what he thought. So he creates a feast. Hey, y'all, we're going to keep a feast in the 8th month. Listen, Mr. Armstrong. Let's go to him for the next 5 minutes, and then I'll say so long, and we'll be back in the morning, God willing, with I need to read another chapter because of the bad recording on the last time we did it from the United States and Britain and Prophecy. That's going to relate a little bit to what Mr. Armstrong is saying here. Let's go to, let me change the lower third real quickly to Mr. Armstrong's name as we start it. And let's go to God's End Time Apostle Herbert Armstrong for a few minutes as he speaks about what ancient Israel did and a little bit about where we are right now today. We may run a few minutes over, 90 minutes, just a little bit. We're going to give Mr. Armstrong opportunity, not only opportunity, but for our good, we're going to hear Mr. Armstrong for a little bit here.
Month festivals of Israel, which was the Feast of Tabernacles, to the 8th month. And also he changed the 7th day of the week, or the Sabbath day, from the 7th day to the 8th day, which was Sunday, or the first day of the week, the beginning of another week. And so a great division was made. Now, the next thing that King Jeroboam did was to put away all of the Levites, who were the priestly tribe. They were the better educated people. They were the most highly educated, the most affluent people in Israel, but he put them away because he was afraid they would lead the people back to King Rehoboam, and Jeroboam would lose out on his throne. And so the tribe of Levi joined with Judah also, and the three tribes of Judah, Benjamin and Levi, became known as the kingdom of Judah. They were not Israel. They were now the kingdom of Judah. Now for the time of 19 different kings and 7 dynasties, the kings of Israel continued to rebel against their God, the Creator. And finally, God had warned them that he would drive them out, and finally he did. And now we trace the history of what happened in 2 Kings, the 17th chapter, beginning with verse 5. Then the king of Assyria came up throughout all the land and went to Samaria, Israel's capital and Israel's land. The whole land was called Samaria by that time, and besieged it 3 years. That's from 721 to 718 BC. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Israel, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel, no, not the Jews, carried Israel away into Assyria and placed them in Halah and in Habor by the river of Gozan. Well, this was in the southern shores, near the general area, the southern shores of the Caspian Sea, and in the cities of the Medes. Therefore, the Lord, or the Eternal, was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah only, or the kingdom of Judah. They were left with their capital in Jerusalem, and that was all of Israel that was left in Palestine, in that land, the original so-called Holy Land. Now continuing in verse 23, until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had said by all the servants, the prophets, so was Israel, now not the Jews, but Israel, carried away out of their own land to Assyria unto this day. That is the day that this was written. And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon, and from Cutha, and from Ava, and from Hamath, and from Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria, instead of the children of Israel. In other words, the people called Israel had been moved out of their land. Now they had dwelt in the land called Samaria, and only the kingdom of Judah remained in Judea, or the land surrounding Jerusalem. But Samaria was in northern Palestine, and they were all moved from their farms, from their cities, from their homes, over to the southern shores of the Caspian Sea, and placed them, that is, these Gentiles from Babylon and other cities over there, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. And they possessed Samaria and dwelt in the cities thereof. Now, they were the ones that were called Samaritans in the time of Christ. Now, the Jews in the time of Christ were from the kingdom of Judah. And they are the ones that Christ came to, his own. Christ himself was of the tribe of Judah, and he came to his own, who received him not. So, the nation Israel finally lost its identity. It was driven out away from God. They lost their identity and became known as the lost 10 tribes. God, meantime, had made an everlasting covenant with Israel. It's recorded back in Exodus 31. He had made a covenant with them that was for all eternity, an everlasting covenant with all Israel. This was long before the division between Israel and Judah. This goes clear back into the days of Moses. Now I want to read you that covenant. And it is in Exodus 31, and I'll begin here with verse 13, where God said to Moses, "Speak also unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily my Sabbaths you shall keep. For it," that is the Sabbath, "is a sign between me," that is God, "and the children of Israel throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord that doth sanctify you," or that I am the Lord that sets you apart from other nations.
And brethren, that's a good point right there where we're out of time for the normal Bible study time. I'm going to take just a few more minutes and pick up where Mr. Armstrong left off and relate it to some of the current news. God, as he was pointing out there, God separated Israel from the other nations. And what's happening and what's happened this past week between the EU and the UK, very important to notice. I started to mention something as I was telling you. We had equipment problems Wednesday night. Something extremely significant happened on Wednesday this week. And before we close, I just want to remind you of that. I covered that in great detail. I couldn't do Wednesday night's World Watch News program until Thursday afternoon, because staying up to 4 o'clock in the morning, by the time I got the equipment fixed, I was drooping. I was like, wow, man, I can't even hold my eyes open. I don't know how I could do this 1-hour newscast. So I got 7 hours sleep, got up and then did the Wednesday night program on Thursday, which very important program. A very important, significant thing happened that day from a comment that the German Chancellor Angela Merkel made addressing the UK's Prime Minister Theresa May. I'm going to repeat the words she made in just a moment that are extremely significant. It's incredible. It's amazing. I mean, it makes me believe God inspired her to say it, especially when we look at Isaiah chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, that explains when Israel needs to be punished. Like Mr. Armstrong was just talking about, a punishment Israel had to suffer, ancient Israel had to suffer, way back, when the 10 tribes that were in Samaria were taken over to the Caucasus Mountains by the ancient Assyrians, the very people that exist today in Germany and Austria. And the very people that God says in Isaiah chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, he uses, as he used back then when he took them from Samaria to the Caucasus Mountains as captives, as slaves. And he's going to use them again soon when this fifth seal opens up, as he says he will do in Isaiah 10, verses 5 and 6. And I keep pointing over this direction because I have a Bible over here. Let me grab it. Let's quickly go to Isaiah 10. I'm going to stretch over just a little bit from normal Bible study time. And those of you that watch from the UK, I know a lot of you have told me you're watching the what you do for a morning Sabbath service is you watch the Friday night Sabbath Eve Bible study. So since a Sabbath service would normally be 2 hours, maybe it'd be okay if I go halfway in between there and go over just a little bit, so we can end on a note that really rings in with what God was teaching us to be watching for through Mr. Armstrong. That's just, man, it's at our nose with what's happened this week even. And we should definitely be praying as Christ instructed us in Matthew 24, verse 20, that our flight be not in the winter, because things are sprucing up and spinning around quickly, and we're going to have a longer winter this year because of it being the leap year on the Hebrew calendar this year. That means the spring officially on God's calendar will not start until a month later. That's why your Groundhog Day works out the way it does. Some of those people that run the Groundhog Day, they're sneaking over and looking at the Jewish calendar and saying, hey, is this year a leap year? If it is, we're going to tell everybody they got 6 more weeks of winter. That's because since the spring starts on the Hebrew calendar on the first day of the first month, and that month is later in a year after a leap year, so to position it with the Roman calendar, because God holds up the spring because of the leap year on the Hebrew calendar, to juxtaposition the Roman calendar to seem like it's right with spring and all that, they tell you the groundhog didn't see its shadow, so we're going to have 6 more weeks of winter. Ha, 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 ha. You know, when you understand, I mean, it's a big joke, it's funny, and when you understand God's truth, you can see what men are doing, you know, and they know God does something through his Hebrew calendar, but they go along with the world in this Roman calendar, and they don't explain it, how they understand it, and how they know when the groundhog's going to see its shadow or not, based on the Hebrew calendar. There's going to be a longer winter because there's a leap year on the Hebrew calendar, a whole extra month before the first day of the first month gets to us. But God uses the Assyrians. Here's the explanation of that in Isaiah 10. If you want to flip there with me, it's verses 5 and 6. O Assyrian. And we're able to know today the Assyrians, those who took ancient Israel captive from Samaria to the Caucasus Mountains, that mountain range that runs between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, between Russia and north of those mountains, and Georgia south of those mountains. There's a whole mountain range there, and that acts as a barrier, a border. Great way of keeping captive people captive. And that's where the Assyrians were holding the 10 tribes that became lost from that point, captive there, got lost to the world. But then when the Persians came down and beat up upon the Medes and Persians came down and beat up upon the Assyrians, they weren't able to hold Israel captive anymore. Now, much of Israel migrated with the ancient Assyrians into Germany. But from there, since the Germans didn't have the power they had over them in the Caucasus Mountains, they'd been beat up badly by the Medes and Persians, they lost their hold over the 10 tribes of Israel, who then migrated on northwest. You can trace this history. It takes a lot of reading, but you can shake it out and you can see, this is how it happened. And so the Assyrians stayed in Germany and the area that's been cut off called Austria. So you got your Germans and your Austrians, or your modern day Assyrians from the Bible, who God says, O Assyrian. God calls the Assyrians the rod of mine anger. The rod of mine anger. Well, what do you do with a rod when you're angry with a son or daughter? Or, what did parents used to do? They go out and get a rod, a branch, a limb off of a tree, and you call it a rod, and spank the kid with that rod. The rod of God's anger are the Assyrians. Now, he explains it further, the two, in just these two verses. He also says this, to put more emphasis on it, and the staff in their hand, the staff in the hand of the Assyrians, is mine indignation. So God assigns to the Assyrian his anger against his people. He's going to explain that in the rest of this verse. And he's using those people as the whipping agents over his people. Listen to the rest of this. Some of you know it already, but it's a good reminder, a good review. We should have it, especially after I remind you of the words that German Chancellor Angela Merkel spoke on Wednesday this week. Amazing words. I'll repeat them in just a moment. Verse 6, God says, I will send him. He's just been talking about the Assyrians that he uses as the rod of his anger. I'll send him, the Assyrians, against an hypocritical nation and against the people of my wrath. Now, what people would that be other than the people whose forefathers stood before God at Mount Sinai and said, yes, Lord, you be our God. Give us all these wonderful blessings. We'll be your people. We will obey your voice diligently and all your commands and judgments and statutes. Yes, Lord, we'll do that. And then turn right around and immediately began disobedience, with Jeroboam taking the people and creating a feast in the 8th month and celebrating the Sabbath on the 8th day of the week. In other words, the first day of the week. On Sunday, worshiping Baal. An hypocritical nation. We promised we'd obey and we disobey. And so God's wrath, we become the people of God's wrath, having promised we'd obey and being a bunch of hypocrites like stubborn heifers who don't obey. And I'll send him against those people, against the hypocritical nation and the people of my wrath, and will give him a charge to take the spoil, just like a victor in war over his enemy takes their stuff, he takes their spoil, and those who remain alive, who aren't killed in the process of war, are taken as prey, as God says he'll have the Assyrians do here in this modern day time, for this prophecy for modern day Israel. Duality, it related back then in its former type, it relates now in much greater fulfillment in these latter days, to take those that remain alive as prey, as captive, and to tread them down like the common mud of the streets, to trample them like mud. God explains through Ezekiel, after all the cities are laid waste, Ezekiel 6, verse 6, with the generals of Germany saying, as God's end-time apostle explained it, the generals of Germany toward the end of World War II, before the war was even over, were saying, we've lost this battle. I mean, hands down, we've lost this battle. We realize our mistake was to create multiple fronts and then get in a war with the United States involved and the UK. What we should have done was knock out the UK and the US first before we got into big wars in other parts of the world. We should have knocked out these big countries, superpowers that became the forefront strong allies that beat us. Well, only 3 of them. They had their foot on France. France was one of the 4 allies, the U.S., the U.K., Russia, and France. But France was trampled down, was held captive, was held down, was taken submissive by Germany. And many of the lives of the people, the men from the U.K. and from the U.S. were lost rescuing France. My father's would have been lost. He was a paratrooper. 80% of the men that did jumps related to that were shot in the air before they could even hit ground. My dad would have been on one of those jumps, but he volunteered, and they took the volunteers ahead first, and then made a decision to not stop and pick up the volunteers they had flown ahead to a certain city, and they were going to pick them up on the way with the rest. They decided to short jump that and do the jump quicker, and all those men that jumped, 80% of them were killed. My dad, thankfully, was left on the ground during that horrible time, and Otherwise, I'd have never been born if he had been one of the 80% shot down in the air. But they said they need to knock out the major allies in the next round of war. So they've already set Ezekiel 6:6 in motion in their mind. And as God's end-time apostle Herbert has explained, he said when the fifth seal opens up, the Great Tribulation, the first thing they're going to do is nuke all of the cities of the UK, and later that same day or the next day, all of the cities of the US. That'll fulfill what Ezekiel said in Ezekiel 6:6. All your cities will be laid waste if you don't repent. It'll also fulfill what the generals plotted toward the German generals toward the end of World War II when they said, our big mistake was not to knock out these major players that got involved here before we did anything else. And they said, in the next battle, in other words, the next round of World War, in World War III, that's how they'll do it. They'll blitzkrieg, which means like a lightning bolt, without announcement. Boom! They'll go in and hit all the cities of the UK, all the cities of the US. And they'll do it after having grabbed Russia and stomped them down, and they'll send the very missiles that Russian President Vladimir Putin said we've got 130 aimed at. We've got stealth missiles that are indefensible. No present or future defense system can knock these things out of the air the way they're designed to fly. Stealthy, low altitude, fast. Whoosh, you can't knock them out before they hit target. So Germany will grab Russia in a blitzkrieg, grab those missiles, launch them off to the U.S. They'll first of all have launched some of their own missiles at the U.K. and wipe out all the cities. That, as Ezekiel explains through the relation of the second seal of war and the third and fourth seals of famine and pestilence, the war part of it, the second seal will kill 1/3 of the people in these attacks at the beginning of the fifth seal. A second third will die from the radiation fallout, from famine and pestilence, from the radiation. And the third that remain alive, the Germans will take captive, but not hold them in the United States. They'll transport them over to the Holocaust museums, now turned into functional Holocaust buildings in Europe, where they'll procedurally kill a number of the people. But God says the overall number through Ezekiel, the hairs in the skirt, will represent about 10% of the whole population of the earth will be able to live on over into the world tomorrow after Christ returns. That means 90% of the present world will be wiped out. That's a lot of blood to be cleaned up. And the first few months of the kingdom of God is going to be a whole lot of cleanup of the mess and destruction of round 3 of World War and the many who will have been killed. But now, what did the German Chancellor say on Wednesday, Stephen? Some of us didn't hear your news report. We don't know. You've left us in the dark. Would you please tell us? Yes, I will. Thanks for staying tuned. I hope you're still with us here. By the way, let me say quick before I tell you what the German Chancellor said. Greetings to Ben. Happy Sabbath to you, who I see has been live here with us. Ben, I often pray for, as he asked me to do, for him and his wife. And I've told Ben, maybe, Ben, you won't mind if I share this with some of the rest of the people. Ben's name is Ben Coppola, Coppola. And I made this little deal with God. Sometimes in my prayers, I try to put life into it. I put a little humor in my prayers, and I made this deal with God when I was having a problem remembering Ben's last name fully or correctly at times. I'd kind of chop it up. Ben, I was having a hard time with Coppola for a while. So I said, God, when I say Ben Coca-Cola, will you please know that I'm talking about Ben Coppola? And so I still will say, God, it's time now for me to pray my Coca-Cola prayer for Ben Coca-Cola, meaning Ben Coppola. So I got this little thing, so I'll daily rattle off some prayers for Ben Coca-Cola. All right, so Ben, thank you for listening. I hope you didn't mind my sharing my craziness and silliness with others here that sometimes I do, and I've told Ben about that, and he didn't seem to be offended, so I'm hoping he's not now. But greetings also to Dwight. Dwight, I'll just mention your first name here since you and I haven't talked a lot, but happy Sabbath to you. And to Dominic Mancini, hello to you, and wish you too a great and peaceful Sabbath, and which Dominic sent out to all. Dominic Mancini. And Dominic, you've made me curious ever since I've seen your name here on Facebook to want to ask you, are you related to Henry? I never got around to asking you that, but you know, the great music composer, Henry Mancini. I loved some of Henry Mancini's music. They used to play some of that at the college dances, and some of the dancing pieces would be beautiful Henry Mancini pieces, but maybe it's just the same last name. But Dominic Mancini, happy Sabbath to you as well. And oh, let's see, Dominic's in there. Capola means hat in Italian. Oh, okay, so well, hats off to Dominic for that, and to Ben, but still, because the name sounds like a little bit like Coca-Cola. That's what I say in my prayers. Father, now time for my Coca-Cola part of my prayer, praying for Ben. Ben asked me to say some prayers. And once in a while, we need to ask other brethren to pray for us and get some extra help, you know, and get God's attention a little better and stronger on something that we might need or have maybe a little problem with or something. Just ask others to help you out and pray. Dominic, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. Let me see. All right, there's some others, but I can't get the screen to show me that. So let me finish up because of time. So, greetings to any and all who are watching, whether you're watching live and I can see you, or you made a comment, or whether you are, actually I just was responding to those who made comments, or whether you're watching later from the archive. Still, we wish you a happy Sabbath. But what did the German Chancellor say that, Stephen, you're saying is so significant that she said to the Prime Minister of the UK on Wednesday? She said, and I only saw it in one source, in a British newspaper called The Sun. I don't doubt it, though, and I actually have asked Paul Kiefer, who was in my class at college for the first 2 years until he was made an upperclassman our sophomore year, because he had previous college and was a 3-year student instead of a 4-year student. He graduated in 3 years, so he came in and was class of 74 the first 2 years. Then his senior year, he became part of the class of 73. And I can't remember whether they would do that in the junior year or senior year. Maybe your last 2 years, you became upperclassman after just 1 year. Anyway, he graduated in 3 years, became part of class of 73, was assigned to work in Germany in the field ministry under Herr Schnee, and served the German people. He's serving some German people now, and Paul and I communicate once in a while by email. He lives in this state, in Mobile, 5 months out of the year, and then 7 months out of the year he's in Germany, over there living in Germany, and seeing German brethren there. And so while he's in Germany now, and we've been communicating by email, I wrote him and said, hey, Paul, I see what the German Chancellor said here on Wednesday in this British Sun newspaper report, and I've asked Paul to give me any, if he would give me any reports he can find of that statement by the German Chancellor in any of the German newspapers there. So I heard back from him, but he hadn't commented. He hadn't come back to me with finding any sources yet. So, Paul, if you're listening, I hope you are, Mr. Kiefer, I hope you're watching or looking for that for me. And then we'll let me know if you find some of those. I'll appreciate it, and I'll share that here. But what the German Chancellor said that was so significant was this. She said to the Prime Minister of the UK, you should take time to look into the abyss. Now, that brings prophetic language into play. You know, in Revelation 17, verse 8, I put that scripture up. I wish I had it right here now, but I can just tell you. I hope all of you will look in your own Bibles too. The King James Version renders the word that is abyss in Greek, abyssus, it renders that Greek word abyss as the bottomless pit in the King James Version. There are some versions of the Bible that actually just translate it straight across as the abyss. But, that's a synonymous term. What do they call those? Not antonym, but synonyms. It's a synonym, and more than a synonym. It's very synonymous, a parallel word. The abyss, the bottomless pit, essentially same thing. And that makes her comment relative to Revelation 17, verse 10. And, try to put it in context and everything. Whether the German Chancellor was saying it wittingly, with understanding, or unwittingly, I believe God inspired her to say it to catch some of our attention to it, and maybe a call to the people of Britain, the modern-day descendants of Ephraim throughout the UK, and his brother, the modern-day descendants of Ephraim's twin brother Manasseh, the two sons of Joseph, here in the United States, who received the birthright, double portion promise of the wealth of the world, having for a long time, these two nations having held the 3/4 of the whole world's wealth under our resources. But now Revelation 17 and verse 8, I got to hurry and finish this up, says, and remember now, the German Chancellor statement was to the Prime Minister of the UK that you should take the time to look into the abyss. Now listen what happens from the abyss, according to Revelation 17, verse 8. The beast that you saw. All right, before I go further, let me just quickly clue us in on the beast mentioned in verse 8 of Revelation 17. Is one of those people mentioned in verse 10, just 2 verses later, where it talks about, and there are 7 kings. This particular beast is actually part of the system that is all 7 of those kings, but especially that last king, that 7th king of Revelation 17:10, where it says there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, Justinian through Napoleon, and one is Mussolini in 1935 to 1945. And the other, who we're watching for, now you've got 5 fallen and one is who's gone now since 1945. And the other, so the 5 and the 1 are 6. You only got 7 kings. The other, that's the 7th one, the one that's left, is not yet come. So we're watching for that last one, that 7th one, who's not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short space. We know that short space is 2.5 or 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation, and through the first part of it till the heavenly signs, and then the last year of Great Tribulation with God pouring in his wrath during the year-long Day of the Lord, 7th seal part of that. So that 7th king, and all of the kings actually, are this beast that's being referred to in verse 8 here of the same chapter, Revelation 17. The beast that you saw was and is not and shall ascend. Now he was for 1,260 years continuous reign from Justinian in 554 AD to Napoleon's downfall at the Battle of 1814, in that year, 1814. He tried a comeback effort in 1815 with the Battle of Waterloo. Everybody knows how badly his comeback effort failed when the British were able to, God gave them understanding of Napoleon's battle plan, so they were able to encircle it and surprise Napoleon that they knew what he was doing and that they encircled it, cut him off, and beat him badly because of God revealing Napoleon's battle plan to the British, to Reuben's brother Ephraim. So he was from 554 AD to 1814. And is not from 1814 to 1935. And then he was again from 1935 to 1945, and now again he's is not. So that first is not between 1814 and 1935 tells you he only went dormant. He meaning the beast or the old Holy Roman Empire, which we're talking about as the beast from 554 to 1814. That was the whole old Holy Roman Empire through the reigns, the dynasties of Justinian through Napoleon, 5 of those dynasties, 5 of those 7 kings of Revelation 17, verse 10. And the one is pops up in 1935. So here, ascending out of the abyss or the bottomless pit is Mussolini for 9.5 years, same length of time that Napoleon reigned from the fall of 1804 to the spring of 1814. Same time periods of the year, this fall of 1935 to the spring of 1945, Mussolini reigned, and then was shot in the belly on April 28, 1945. That ended the one is 6th kingship. And so then the Holy Roman Empire went into dormancy, went back into the abyss or the bottomless pit. Once again, from 1945 until now and into the near future, when that Holy Roman Empire, that beast shall ascend out of the bottomless pit again. That's the next part of the verse. The beast that you saw was from 554 to 1814, and then is not between the time until 1935 to 1945, was again. Now he is not again because he's in the abyss or the bottomless pit, the abyss or bottomless pit. And the next part of the verse says, and shall ascend out of the abyss, or as the King James words, the Greek word abyss, the bottomless pit. And here we had German Chancellor Angela Merkel saying on Wednesday words that Tom Williams, who used to work at headquarters in letter answering, and may have answered some of the letters that some of you wrote in. You didn't have to just ask your local minister. You could write to headquarters and say, hey, what does Mr. Armstrong say about this? Well, or what's the deal on this or that? And they were all trained under Mr. Armstrong so that we all spoke the same thing. And in letter answering, Tom Williams, that was his full-time job, to answer people's letters. So you may have gotten an answer that Tom Williams actually penned and wrote to you under the tutelage of Mr. Armstrong from headquarters, his full-time job. And I wrote to him after I saw Mrs. May's thing and said, hey, Tom, what do you think of this statement and comment? Tom wrote me back, said, Stephen, I consider that to be the equivalent of Winston Churchill having said the words that Mr. Armstrong would so often quote about how an unseen hand from someplace is miraculously intervening and working out things here. That unseen hand from someplace. He equated the words of Mrs. Chancellor on Wednesday this week with the significance of the words of Winston Churchill that, again, Mr. Armstrong so often quoted and repeated. And so here's what you said, and this relates to this Revelation 17, verse 8. I got to get off. I'm 3 minutes over 2 hours. Let me state this, and we got to stay so long till the morning. And thanks for staying with me, those of you stay with me. I hope you feel like, man, this is worth it. That is indeed significant, Steve. Mrs. Merkel having said to Mrs. May, Germany saying to the UK, and by principle to the U.S. too, all of the descendants of Joseph, we better wake up. We better take the time to look into the abyss, because what's coming out of the abyss? The beast shall ascend out of the abyss, out of the bottomless pit. Revelation 17, verse 8. Friends, the German Chancellor was saying, you should know know your history. History is going to repeat itself. This old Holy Roman Empire is going to be revived. She was essentially saying, you kooks in the UK, you're going to be under our thumbs. You better not be making us so angry. We done told you we're not going to renegotiate that Brexit deal. We've given you what you put on the table. which you prematurely put on the table before you got the backing of your parliament. Then you run to your parliament and say, you're going to okay what I did? And they say, no. Oh, man, you did that backward, Mrs. May. I'm sorry to be so blunt in saying that, but you did that backward. Back-asswards, as some would say. Anyway, you caught Mrs. Merkel's ire, which God may have used. You know, Mr. Armstrong, sir, if you were alive right now and you could hear the report of Mrs. Merkel's words, he'd be pounding on a lectern saying, brethren, you better wake up. This thing, Germany's already warning about what's going to come out of the abyss. Take a look take the time and take a look into the abyss. See what's going to come out of there. We are going to come out of there one more time, and this time our generals are going to be a lot smarter than they were before. We are going to do with God's blessing of Isaiah 10, 5 and 6, with him using us as his whipping boy or whipping agent, using us as the rod of his anger and of his indignation. He is going to have us destroy, Ezekiel 6:6, all of the cities of the birthright sons of Joseph. Ephraim in the U.S., Manasseh in the U.K. I said that backward. Ephraim in the U.K., Manasseh in the U.S. 2/3 of our people, boom, 1/3 taken captive and killed from the Holocaust museums. A few able to live on over into the world tomorrow. What about you? Where will you be? Will you be taken captive with them and then be asked to work on the Sabbath so you can, Revelation 3:18, yourself out of being exited from God's not worthy to stand before the Son of Man in the first resurrection? Buy your way out. As Christ said, I counsel you to buy of me gold tried in the fire, the fiery trial of martyrdom. You think you can face that? Christ will come knock on your door. Then, not now, we need to seek him now. He'll knock on your door and say, hold fast. This time, don't compromise. Do everything I say. Endure like I did to the end. The martyrdom you have to endure in order to stand before me. And if you do it, you'll be at the marriage supper with me. Friends, I'm out of time. I got to go. I'd love to say more. Those of you who can, God willing, will be back here on this same channel. Sabbath services on the Facebook Live page, Sabbath.tv, otherwise in the archive. Tomorrow morning, 9:30 a.m. Central Time. I get up so that that's live. 2:30 in the afternoon in the UK, as you people asked me to do before sunset. So, God willing, I'll be up. We'll be on at 9:30 in the morning, and we'll be covering Chapter 3 of the United States and Britain in Prophecy that Mr. Armstrong has been encouraging us to read and reread and know, just like also Mystery of the Ages. But I got to get out of here, friends. Thanks for joining us. Let me back this up to our going out of here Sabbath service music. And I wish you, as some of you have wished us, happy Sabbath, good night of sleep, refreshing sleep, brethren. Shabbat Shalom. See you in the morning. Good night.